the backbone of modern economy and an essential component for growth. SMEs and startups are crucial in fueling economic growth. The evolving entrepreneurial drive is an engine for innovation as we explore the dynamics that drive success across vital sectors. Today, we stand at the crossroads of global perspectives and local ambitions, where thought leaders transform nascent ideas into flourishing enterprises. From Silicon Valley's tech giants to emerging markets' disruptive innovators, startups play a crucial role in shaping our future. Another facet to this ecosystem and venture capitalists, providing the critical resources and mentorship needed to turn groundbreaking ideas into reality. This creates the foundation for the second edition of the MSX Chairman's Dialogue, hosted by Mr. Mohammed Al Ardhi. Today's virtual event will embark on a mission to uncover the intricacies governing the economics of global startups and venture systems, while providing a detailed overview of Oman's SMEs and their pivotal role in driving economic diversification and innovation. Joining him today is Dr. Ann-Kristin Achleitner, a German business economist and academic luminary who brings a wealth of experience that spans venture capital, startup ecosystems, corporate governance, and stock exchanges. Her guidance has been instrumental in transforming simple ideas into thriving enterprises, with some ventures even reaching outer space, placing satellites into orbit. Dr. Achleitner's impact extends far beyond Germany. As a distinguished affiliated professor of entrepreneurial finance studies at the Technical University of Munich and the scientific co-director at the Center for Entrepreneurial and Financial Studies, please join us in welcoming Professor Dr. Ann-Kristin Achleitner to the MSX Chairman's Dialogue for a compelling virtual discussion on the topic, the startups and venture systems from a global perspective.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Muscat Stock Exchange, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each one of you to the second edition of Muscat Stock Exchange Chairman's Dialogue. I'm your MC today, Haura and I am thrilled to be guiding you through this insightful conversation. The Chairman's Dialogue is a platform designed to foster thought leadership and discussions on various aspects of the capital market. Today's edition promises to be particularly engaging, featuring a dialogue between our esteemed chairman, Mr. Mohammed Al Ardhi, and a prominent guest speaker in the financial world, Professor Dr. Ann-Kristin. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of the seminar, so make sure to note down any questions that you may have for either one of our speakers today in the chat that you can find in this very seminar. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite our chairman, Muscat Stock Exchange Chairman, Mr. Mohammed Al Ardhi, to deliver his opening remarks and introduce our guest speaker for today's session.
Aura, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum jami'an. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for the second session of MSX Chairman Dialogue, which will train the spotlight on crucial elements of GDP growth and economic development, namely promoting SMEs and creating a thriving venture capital environment. According to the World Trade Organization, SMEs represent over 90% of the global business, contributing 60 to 70% of employment generation and 55% of GDP of developed economies. Given the challenges facing the global economy, governments are increasingly turning to SMEs as harbingers of sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Moreover, SMEs are crucial enablers of innovation, job creation, and social cohesion. Oman has been according the highest priority to SME development. The SME Development Authority, created through a royal decree, endeavors to make SMEs the bedrock of Oman's economy and an essential component of its sustainable development. This will be accomplished through programs aimed at developing individuals and the community, diversifying sources of income, and increasing the contribution of SME to the GDP. Startups, enterprises are also require financing, incubation, and mentoring to build scale and growth. Venture capital plays an important role in building a startup ecosystem by providing access to capital. In addition, VCs bring with them experience and knowledge, a network of contacts of potential customers, suppliers, or other investors. Venture capital is often the fuel that enables startups to grow quickly and turn their innovative ideas into reality. Without the financial backing and expertise of VC funds, many of today's technology giants would never have seen the light of today. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Airbnb. The Oman Investment Authority Future Fund, launched earlier this year, has a mandate to invest in a wide range of industries with a view to develop the national economy and attract foreign investments. The fund's capital of $5.2 billion will be invested over 5 years, with 90% of its capital being allocated to new or existing investment projects and the remaining 10% being split between SMEs and startups. Countries which boast of a robust venture capital ecosystem have successfully incubated and scaled promising enterprises. One country which stands out in this respect is Germany, where a vibrant venture capital industry has supported a wide range of industries from fintech and health tech to deep tech and sustainability. There are few who are better versed in these domains than our special guest speaker tonight, Dr. Ann-Kristin Achleitner. Dr. Ann-Kristin is a global business and academic leader serving as a distinguished affiliated professor at Technical University of Munich, Germany. Her wide experience includes venture capital, startups, governance, stock exchanges, and academia. She advises different governments in Germany and Europe on VCs, stock markets, and other facets of the economy. She has unrivaled experience in helping startups to grow from a simple idea to becoming successful companies. Her expertise transcends planet Earth, as Dr. Ann-Kristin helping a few German startups reach outer space and place satellites in the Earth orbit. She holds board positions at a number of companies such as Linde, DHL, Lazard, and Invesco. She is also associated with a number of non-public entities and foundations, including the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. We are honored and privileged to have you this evening, Ann-Kristin. Over to you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your kind introduction. And let me start with expressing my deep respect for the vision and for the mission that Oman has. That resonates very well with me as an academic, as well as a policy advisor, coming from a country, as you mentioned, that is known, for its SMEs as being the backbone of the economy, and at the same time is having a long-standing quest to build up its startup ecosystem. I'm convinced that the Muscat Stock Exchange can and will play an important role here. And let me explain this, and I'm honored that I'm allowed to share the experiences we have done about what works, what doesn't work, in 29 years that we have been working on this in Germany. If we just look back, one should remember that Germany was a debt-oriented country before we had the reunification. That was the time that we had to open up for the capital markets. The German, so-called German Stock Exchange was only founded in 1992 from having been the Frankfurt, a local stock exchange before. So we have been through this process, and I hope we have some observations here from Germany, but from other countries that might be interesting. At least this is what I hope. Let me start with the first very important concept that we have, and that is the concept of the flywheel that influences everything that we do in policy advising. If I talk about the flywheel, I mean that we don't think about the venture process and the SME starting process as something that we start at the beginning, like we start up the companies, we let them grow, and finally at some point in time, they go to the stock exchange, and our support system grows in line with the companies growing. But we consider the whole thing as a circle, and we can also start at the end, so to say, with the stock exchange, because we know if there are some successful exits, they will have a signaling effect. They will mean that companies can grow. They mean that there will be returns for investors. And these single IPOs will lead to more investors coming into the country. This will support the venture ecosystem. This supports startups. So this is the whole idea. If you're thinking about the self-reinforcing cycle, why we consider it very important to start with a stock exchange too, especially bearing in mind the time frames it takes to build something up. And we think that this has a very important signaling effect, even for the first phase. We have just, and if I mean the Research Institute at TU Munich, published research in an academic journal last week about the first time 11,000 European startups, where we looked at the question, why would they leave the country? Now, it's not about growing, but it's about keeping the entrepreneurial talent you have in your country. And there are some very interesting insights why and when they would move, etc. But the one point that was striking is that they don't leave when they have something missing, which in the case of Germany would be growth financing at the later stage. But they do leave on average in the second year when they don't have a financing need, but when they anticipate that they're going to have one. Now, I don't go into why we know it's a financing need, but it's very interesting because it shows you the importance of also looking at later stages in order to keep companies in the country and to grow them. So this is what I meant with the flywheel and the importance of a local startup system that one already has. This is what we have in our back hat. When we look at the government policy, I've been engaged over all these years in various commissions on the EU level. I've advised, both chancellors and the local governments. And what you see in all those incidents, in all those situations and experiences, is that you need a comprehensive strategy to move forward venture capital and startups. Even if you have an innovation policy and then there is an expert commission, for example, in Germany on innovation, you need the various different disciplines. Let me give you an example. I'm focused on deep tech, so I'm very interested in having highly skilled quantum technology people, fusion engineers, communication, artificial intelligence experts. At the same time, if you look at it from a sociological perspective, we know that it's very important for innovation to get rooted in a society that everyone in the population can use it and apply it, which is obviously not for quantum, but you know what I mean, for communication and digital things. So it's the different perspectives you need in there. Apart from it, that all the different lines go together, like tax policy is always innovation policy. You need the financing that has to be aligned, the educational strategies, and this has to be an overall program. To show what this means on a, for example, negative side, we could see in Germany that the biotech industries had serious issues because of the legal restraints it had while it was being funded. And we saw that you cannot compensate some problems with just more money, that like making it more difficult on the left side and helping with the right hand. To give you a very positive example that we see with the new industries, if you take, for example, the development in the whole food tech industry, Singapore is going ahead, having decided that the food tech industry is important for their country and having changed the regulatory setup so that everyone feels safe. If I say everyone feels safe, I mean investors who know that they have the security that that sort of company can develop. We have exactly the same debate in the fusion field right now. So it's, as I said, important that you have the strategy, and within the strategy, missions focusing on something like oil and gas, as you have it, can be very important because they align the interests and they bring people to join forces. A very important aspect that we discuss when we talk about government is the different roles the states can have, because obviously we just discussed regulation. We all know that funding is important, but in the whole development of venture companies and SMEs, there are various different roles that are also very important. There's the role as the state as client, which is something that we discuss heavily in Europe, as in comparison to what is happening in the United States. It's very important, you know, that the state and the things you would order is also working with SMEs, and you have policies in that field in France and Great Britain too. We have the state as a potential enhancer of financial possibilities. It doesn't need to be equity. It also can be complex fund-to-fund structures where you help that have been developed in some fields. And if one bears in mind that the whole field of technological innovation, geopolitics, and financing is more and more getting together and getting closer, the role of the state as an ambassador for its companies, getting abroad or getting companies in, is also more important than it has ever been. And in this whole context, we see that it's a triad of three things that is important from a state government regulation law. This is what we have learned in the contexts that I know. One is to have an ambition. The second one is to execute that ambition, and that is exactly what, you know, the angle that we are challenged with in Europe. So it's the ambition, it's the execution, and then it's the monitoring. Obviously, the monitoring is very difficult, but it can be done. We develop it in certain fields, and it's the better one monitors the KPIs one has, the better one can see whether the execution works. So it's the ambition, the execution, and the monitoring. If you take this and develop the strategy, the big question all political movements or ambitions have in this field, and even business-oriented ones, are how much do you cluster? Obviously, there is a political pressure in all countries to spread the help that you have as broad as possible, which you seem not to do. This is a worldwide phenomenon, as George Lerner from Harvard also said in a speech. But you should rather focus. And if I talk about focus, and I mean people building these systems, it can be on the regional side, on the technology side, or it's, you know, differentiated, coming together. For example, you see in Germany, because we're rather a country of different regions. So you see that we also, apart from the centers in Berlin and Munich, we do have very rich entrepreneurial clusters in fields like, for example, Westphalia, where we have a unity of companies like Miele, we have universities, we have SMEs working together. But we know what these clusters are specialized in, or what other possibilities they have, like, for example, in the field of defense and other fields, test sites are getting more important these days, and you would build these clusters around these tech sites. Now, if I say we have technological clusters, that does not mean that it's only vertical in one specific technology. It also means it's around that technology. You saw that we are supporting new space in Germany, specifically here in Munich. We're building the biggest faculty in that field for airspace engineers. But this does not mean that we all only have micro launches here that we build. It also means that we have the companies that build the, for example, the tanks that have the carbon around it. So we have material innovation that later spreads over to fields like automotive, etc. We use the 3D printing capacities that we have for parts of the rockets that we use. So, you know, it's a whole technological cluster around a theme, but that does not mean that it's only the technology, which is also interesting from a financing perspective, because these companies have different cash flow perspectives than different lines, and it's easier to build this. But this is also being developed. For example, the National Academy of Science and Engineering in Germany that is being set up on the one side by academics, on the other side by engineers. And the practice is right now developing a concept for the state of Bavaria where you have this broader approach if you think of new space. And we have several hundred companies now, startups and SMEs in that field. Now, if I speak about academia is obviously very important. We do have academic plans in fields that you want to develop. We all know this from artificial intelligence. For example, if you take Bavaria, we have some extra 100 chairs, but it also comes to the business scene. And I think that is important because you need this ecosystem, financial ecosystem. In the 90s, we were educating the first investment bankers for Germany. Being in mind what I said, we didn't have investment banking that well grounded there. In the beginning of the 2000s, we were educating the first venture specialists. Now we're very much into finance people for specialized industries. So it was very important in academia to build up also the kind of skills on the one side, on the technical side, but as well as having the entrepreneurial education that was heavily supported by the German state-owned bank, KfW. In the 90s, we founded the first chair in entrepreneurship. We didn't have one in Germany. At the time, we said if you took the gross national product of the United States, compared it to Germany, we would have needed 200 chairs. So we had the first in the 90s that all developed. That was the kickoff, so to say, of entrepreneurial education in Germany. That also means that we have centers around universities, so it's not only academic education. And right now, Munich now has the biggest one in all of Europe, but we have built that for more than 20 years, to be frank. Now, academia is an important part of what we call an ecosystem. And the one lesson we also learned developing it is that you don't develop a certain kind of company only. It's not about startups or SMEs or bigger companies, but how important it is that all those companies come together and work together. And as I said, we have the most important cluster now in Bavaria for this. This is because we have managed to bring those companies together. Now, why would a startup or an SME have to work with an incumbent? I think there are three reasons. First of all, if you develop new technologies, you have to learn how to use them. So it's about developing the product together. Or if you're in verticals, if you're in AI, for example, the same. The second one that is often forgotten is that we have to fund venture companies and small and middle-sized companies with equity. But at the same time, there's another sort of financing that comes from sales, which is very important. We know from the last recession in Germany that the effect of having a drop in sales was the biggest threat, and the bigger threat than having less equity. And the third one coming together is that it might be interesting if you're thinking of trade sales, meaning of later integration of a newly built company on SME in a bigger company. Now, it's very important then to build these around certain fields, like, for example, if you take oil and gas, in the case of Oman, so many startups in Europe or in America dream of working together with oil and gas companies, and in very different fields. If you think of robodogs, if you think of drones, if you think of artificial intelligence being used for dealing things. So it's, these interactions are very important, as we know. And the interesting thing that came out in research and that we now see day to day is that venture companies work specifically well, not only with big companies, as we say, the incumbent companies, but with family-owned companies, because of the longer time horizon. Families as owners very often have less pressure that they would have from shareholding side, and very informal structures. And looking back, the founder of the spin-off in Munich said, if there's one thing she would have done differently, in hindsight, she would have integrated, it's Susanne Klodden of BMW, she would have integrated the family side that's now a part of that center earlier, because we see how important it is of bringing it together. The last person in, or the last party in this ecosystem is obviously the state. And we see, for example, with Station F in France, how life can be easier for startup SMEs if we have easier structures about how to approach certain regulatory procedures. Now, the obvious one, like the elephant in the room, is obviously financing. The state is very important here, as we see in all national systems. But it is important not only for the amount of money they give, but also about how they structure the funding in order to enable a national industry in the venture field to develop. In the early years of my activities at the TU in Munich, we were monitoring for the German state-owned bank, the KfW, every 3 years, how the German venture capital scene developed. And if I talk about developing, it does not only mean that we have players who have a certain size and who are growing in size because of success. It also means that they can provide the professional help that the chairman spoke about, helping companies in general building up and helping them, as we know, in specific industries. Right now, the big challenge in Europe is building up, for example, these financial capital providers in certain branches, because it's not enough to only have general experience, but you should have it in various fields. And this is important in the field of venture capital, but it's also important with SMEs, and it's important with family-owned companies, where we see the effect it has if they have private equity providers, and how important it is, even for broadly international active ones, as we know, to have people who are on the ground, who know the ecosystems that they personally are navigating in. We might touch on that. Apart from the need of having strong local providers, it's obviously the stock exchange, as I mentioned, who's so important and who has to have certain specific segments for these fields, like an SME segment, has to look after the right listing requirements. But as we saw, not only has to design the structure of the segment that SMEs are listed on, and that deal about the tax, together with the state, about the tax situation, but also do the communication part of showing, the first, as I said, the first successful ones, to keep this circle going. When the German stock exchange had the new segment, and we had the first companies that IPO'd in that size, we called the first year, and we tracked them, we called them the new heroes, because they had this kind of effect. So it's about promoting successful SMEs. It's about supporting, which we discussed at length, equity research and credit research. And it's about pushing and helping, like being, wind under the wings of those companies, certain fields that you have to specialize on. What we did for the German Stock Exchange at the time, for example, is that every 2 or 3 months, we looked at and we published a report about a certain segment in the German industry, where we tried to find the companies in that field that later got scouted, like cohorts, where you saw who might be eligible for an IPO. Now, to end my talk here and talking about these ingredients that we have seen in different countries, we saw that the most important of them all, and at the same time the most challenging one, was developing the culture and helping capacity building in that field, in the various fields. Now, obviously, the first one is the entrepreneurial culture that has to develop. And we're talking about education that is not only in universities, but it starts very early on in schools, but if it's done nicely, can have an effect in all fields of life. I mean, we have social entrepreneurs, we have entrepreneurs in a lot of other fields. So it's about education, about entrepreneurial culture, which does not mean everyone has to be entrepreneurial, but that, you know, there is a culture that there's enough of a critical mass, and this is what Germany has achieved the last years, of a critical mass of entrepreneurship that drives the country and, as was said, fosters economic development. The second thing you need is an equity culture, which has also been very difficult coming from a stakeholder society. Some of you might remember the locust debate we had in Europe. And then finally, and we might touch on that in the discussion, the capital market culture that is so important. The stock exchange has done an investor readiness program and support service that was so important because one has to build companies for several years in order to be able to IPO. We think it's at least 3 years that you need, not only to have the accounting structures and everything, but to have the equity story, to have the mindset. And we believe that one thing is IPOing, doing it, going public, as it said. But the challenge on the cultural side is the being public one that we still work on. We're doing progress, but for us, this is one of the biggest challenges right now on the cultural side. I would be happy if some of those ideas might trigger some questions on your side or be interesting for you on your way forward. Thank you. Mohammed, if I may give back to you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. It was really a lot, and we can discuss many things of what you brought. Let me start, Ann-Kristin, because we have a lot of young entrepreneurs watching this. And you know, these sessions is really a bridge between them and global leaders like yourself. First of all, I want to ask you about your own personal journey in academia and startup and venture capital. What would you advise those young entrepreneurs starting their life at the moment?
The point is, and where are they right now? So if they already decided to become entrepreneurs, so if, you know, they're past the educational part and it's not about, you know, how long do you stay in the academic system. I strongly believe, and I've seen it in the power of team startups, yeah, which is one side. If you want to start up a company, if you are born into a family-owned business, what we see is a lot of power in this new generation because they think differently, they grew up differently, that education courses of building the link to the venture scene, which means either rejuvenating the company they have or using other tools like AI, and that being a chance, you know, for a possibility, an opportunity for the family firm that is energized by close contact, as I said, between those two fields.
Thank you very much. Now, going back to some of the themes that you have mentioned, the question that actually a few of the audiences already mentioned it is, how would, in your mind, to mix this local content with foreign talents to produce a startup system in a country like Oman, where you have, you know, very ambitious young entrepreneurs with talents, but obviously not the huge industries that exist there in the Western countries?
I think various comments here, as one can see. I think, for example, as I mentioned, oil and gas is a very powerful, very important industry that you can attach many things to. Now, if it's not about the entrepreneurial talent you have in the country itself, the one you want to get in order to join forces, there are, for example, programs like in Korea, where you would consider which kind of companies would fit what you do in your country. And I could very much, if you remember the example of the new space industry cluster in Germany, imagine that you would consider what could you build around oil and gas or around other questions, where companies might come to Oman or have a subsidiary in Oman, or a twin company that you set up. The second thing is that we do have certain clusters in that field of university education, bringing people together, of having links, like, for example, that you have with the University of Aachen, that is a leading technical university in Europe, where you could bring talent together in the fields or the corporations to work with, so that you could develop, and you have this sort of interchange and having mixed teams. Because what we see these days is that, unlike the old days where everything had to be physical, it's getting much easier to work together now on screens like we do today. For example, there's a quantum technology company that I co-founded, that was co-founded in the times of Corona for a year and a half. And so these things will be much easier moving forward on an international basis, as they used to be before Corona, I think.
You mentioned family businesses, and in Oman, like the rest of the Gulf, and I think like many in the world, many countries in the world, family businesses are really has been the foundation of a lot of the economies. But obviously there are pros and cons in terms of going public, staying private, losing privacy or control or anything like that. How, from your experience in Germany, how has that been looked at, sorted in terms of using this venture capital system or the public markets to grow these companies and make them big? I mean, obviously, we have examples of Walmart or Ford or companies like that started as private family companies, but obviously grew through capital markets and others.
As you know, I've been to Oman the first time in 1988, so I've seen how deep the family culture is rooted in your country, as it is in Germany. I think this is something that you cannot develop. If I say a venture scene is difficult to develop over decades, a very deep-rooted family firm culture is something that you develop over a lot of years and centuries. So you're very similar to what we see in Germany. We have developed in certain fields. Our family tradition is very different from, for example, what you see in Great Britain, where it's it's even a success if you sell your company. In Germany, few family owners have sold their companies until shortly, because you, as I said, it's a culture, you stay with them. However, we have seen two developments before we discuss the stock exchange, as it's a way, a path you're on. The first thing that we have seen was on PE, when I spoke about the equity culture. We have done serious research when we looked at the effects that private equity has on employment, that showed that private equity was used a long time differently in Europe than in this field than it was used in the US. While in the US it was more the bigger companies and restructuring, you could see that in Germany it was a shortage of financing, so that companies that took private equity could grow thanks to it. So it was a growth financing strategy more, so that employment was growing. This has been very important in the German system. And obviously, private equity doesn't mean necessarily that you have to exit with an IPO. We have done a case study, for example, Messer Griesheim, which is a gas company known in Germany, where a family has used private equity in order to restructure also the ownership and has grown. The second thing that we have seen is that private equity has been used for the kind of professionalism that you bring to it, like a breath of fresh air of looking at things differently, working together. Obviously, families have been afraid of that before, but we did research on prejudices you have versus what really happened later. And the interesting thing was that most family firms found out that their prejudices about private equity had been wrong. And those, in hindsight, when we later said, so how did it turn out? Except for those that sold to a rather high price, which makes a lot of sense. If you want to have a high price, you will end with some private equity firm that is more pressured on the restructuring side. There's an inner logic to it. So that has been important. And the interesting thing that we saw is that we thought that if private equity comes in, the company breaks open and you have more external board members, which was actually not the case. It was even less, because the families believed that they had this extra party in there to challenge their dreams. Now, if it comes to IPOs too, as I said, we've seen family firm IPOs. It was easier for those who were consumer oriented. Yeah, and we have more family-owned firms at the German Stock Exchange than one would believe. We have done big studies on those, how this works in the concept, and have done constructed an index at the Research Institute that only covers family-dominated quoted companies at the German Stock Exchange. And one can see that while they try to hide, for example, they invest more in research than quoted companies, because they believe the capital markets would not really respect that, which is very interesting, which you see when you compare internal and external data, that there are other lines that are also different, how they react to crisis, and so that it can even be a strategy to invest into family firms at the stock exchange.
Very interesting. I mean, as you know, we have done some of these family businesses in the Gulf and taken them, and exactly the concerns are exactly the points that you have mentioned. Is how to work with the private equity company to actually bring all this. The global standards, the best practices, the innovation, and work together with them. Ann-Kristin, before I give to Hawra, I want to ask you a question about the role of governments in all this. And I think it is probably even more crucial in the Gulf, in Oman, because there isn't a very mature markets or sectors other than the oil and gas. In terms of, putting regulations that actually that helps innovation, does not stop it, helps startups, does not become bureaucracy. And then in terms of helping them financially as they grow, what would you say is the most important thing governments can bring to the table?
I think that if there's a second industry, and now it's for others to judge what that be, but if there's a second, as I said, it's like a second mission that it is known. And then it's either an industry, as I said, we have it with new space. For example, the fact that a lot of things are located in Luxembourg is due to it. You wouldn't think of Luxembourg as a new space site, but they had early regulation, as Japan too. There are fields where, like also the food tech I mentioned, where you can develop new industries because you have a reliable regulation. But if you have existing industries, I think the important thing is that you would sit down and discuss what would be needed to develop it as you have oil and gas around, in an interaction between industry and government, and then cover all the things, like I said, education, tax, on a horizontal basis, everything that needs together, also with, with academia. With academia, we see that you don't have to change the whole system, but we have certain lighthouses, and you could also, for example, have certain academics there for some time. We have certain lighthouses of professors who are deeply rooted in academia, but at the same time have spin-off experience that could specifically be acquired. If you think of things like logistics, I could imagine, or something else, so that you have this kind of development around this field, and having it together. For example, if you take Japan, Japan has a system, a J system, where in certain fields it's called the J Startup Initiative, where in certain fields, together with industry and government whatsoever, they select their most promising companies, and then they help them as well coordinate way from a private as from a government side. I could imagine something like this could work very well in Oman if you decided on the field where you want to develop things. And I would also take something where you either have a skill on industry. And if I talk about skills, if you think of Germany, you could say Germany is good in automotive production or so, but you could also say, if you look at skills, Germans have experience in running complex processes, which means, building micro launchers is not that different if you scale them up from building cars, for example. So there might be something where, not on the industry, but on the skill side, you could decide on really developing something.
Thank you very much. I want to give Hawra the chance to see if there are questions from the public. Hawra, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Ann and Mr. Al Ardhi, for that comprehensive and thought-provoking exchange. I believe it has shed further light on the important topics Professor Ann has addressed earlier. Now it's time for our audience to participate. We have some time allocated for questions from the online audience. Please feel free to type your questions into the designated chat window, which I can pose to our esteemed speakers. I have selected a few questions that have been submitted by our audience, beginning with one which questions in what ways are alternative funding mechanisms such as crowdfunding and special purpose acquisition company revolutionizing the startup funding landscape in Europe, and particularly the MENA region.
Okay. So I cannot judge on the MENA region. My impression is, as you have funds too, we do have special purpose vehicles there. You would see them very often as as being done instead of venture funds in certain fields if there hasn't been a venture fundraising yet. I believe I'm personally invested in some where I believe in the industries, but I believe if you're a broader investor and you're only starting in the field, that it's more helpful if you're in a broader fund because of the risk allocation that you don't have to decide on. So we do see them, but we push more that you would have venture funds that are bigger or are more specialized instead of, for example, if you take an SPV new space, that you would have a new space fund like we have in Europe or so, and not a single SPV on a company, which you see too. But it depends, as I said, it depends on the experience. Now, yes, crowdfunding has been around for some time and it's developing in some fields. This is right. I personally, however, think that I think it's very important, if you think about the investors, what approach they take and how much they want to understand what they are doing. So the crowd investors mostly are smaller investors, etc. So I don't think that this will really disrupt the whole system. Yeah, I believe for various reasons that, investing in certain venture funds is broader and should be developed more for both sides.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Ann, for that very thorough response. May we move on to our second question, which is which sectors present the most opportunities for venture capital in the MENA region in 2024 and in the upcoming 3 to 5 years?
Obviously the MENA region is great. My understanding is two things. First, and I should have mentioned that, if it comes to venture spirit, I'm impressed whenever I am in your region about the positive aspect you have towards the future, which means, there's much more entrepreneurial drive if you're positive. And my feeling is that you're very open to technology in the population as such, and positive about technology. And in the field of artificial intelligence, for example, the computing power you need, and these things that have to be provided by a government are very well provided for. So I could imagine that, a lot of, there will be a lot of dynamic, that is also pushed, that will be in this field. Apart from that, it depends whether you think of venture as being, of newly funded companies in the early sector, or you believe about it being private capital. I strongly believe that with the population changing, consummation needs and all this, everything that is for day-to-day life, for society will be interesting as private. It doesn't have to be super technology oriented, but being in the field of IT, etc., that has to go with demographies and the population using more products and services in certain fields.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Ann. Another interesting one is when you talk about building a conductive ecosystem that includes SMEs, regulatory bodies, and financiers, how important is it to foster this locally within Oman, especially considering the nation has a growing entrepreneurial spirit and the potential for significant economic diversification?
Do I understand this right? This is about how many clusters you have?
So would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, okay, sorry.
When you talk about building a conducive ecosystem that includes SMEs, regulatory bodies, and financiers, how important is it to foster this locally within Oman, especially considering the nation has a growing entrepreneurial spirit and the potential for significant economic diversification?
I still don't understand it, but I think the point is about being local. I passionately think the local aspect is important, if to have, that you're networked with other ecosystems, but we know it is locally, which does not contradict what I said. You have to be digitally, but that you can be connected, but still, you have a main place that you are connected to. And the diversification means you see this, for example, in our case, we built Munich and Berlin, and now we're spreading. We have a competition right now for other places, which I think is right, if you have this core that you're building around. I don't believe in having everything everywhere at every level. This simply does not work, because even if you're strong locally, there's international competition. Sorry, I don't hear you anymore.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Ann. Apologies about earlier. Another question that has been brought forward is, you mentioned startup leaving countries in the second year as they anticipate financial needs. How can entrepreneurial talent be retained within one country?
Yeah, I think obviously, I think the exchange is important, but the point is where they are. I think it must be important for entrepreneurial talent to know that if they grow their company in the country itself, that there will not be in a worse situation as when they leave. And the interesting thing that we saw in our study is that I would have expected European companies to go to the US, because the markets are bigger. Within Europe, we still have a lot of languages and regulations and whatsoever. So you could imagine someone would go there because it's a big market. It's, companies who have different buying patterns and clients, and which is not the case. They actually moved abroad because of the financing, which we can see because they moved exactly to the place of their lead investors, which means it's very important, and this is what I meant with the flywheel and starting from the stock exchange backwards, so to say, that you have enough financing possibilities, plus that you have enough support. I believe in the smartness that comes with the money, that, if you grow something in a certain industry, that the financiers, the venture capitalists and private equity companies do have those connections, all the connections abroad that you would need to build something from Oman.
Thank you for that thought-provoking response, Professor Dr. Ann. Another one that we have in our chat is, what are some emerging trends and technologies that will shape the future of startups and venture capitals globally?
I think that one of the trends that is so important is the various fields working together. Let me give you an example. You see that the field of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and maybe quantum technology at some time, but artificial intelligence now, and robotics is working very much together, that you would be much quicker using artificial intelligence in coming up with biotechnology insights that you can then test if you have the very soft special robots you would need for experimenting, and I think having these fields coming together will be one of the trends, and underlines again why it is important that if you're in a certain field, you would have people you can discuss with as well on the academic side, but also like scouts, as I would say, on the financing side.
I believe we have some time to ask two more questions. One is, it's interesting to see that we've talked about family-operated companies earlier. In fact, Oman has some strong network of used cases in this regard. However, is this trend of new family businesses dwindling? And if so, may you explain why that's occurring?
So if it comes to new ventures, whether they would be developed into family business, it is too early to tell, because obviously they haven't developed it. We have seen the first ones that are second generation, and the whole idea is that the ventures of today, if they're not unicorns one day, are exactly the SMEs of tomorrow. We call this Mittelstand, and this is part of the structural rejuvenation that you have in an economy. So we strongly hope that this stays the same, even if sociologically we obviously see that second generations are now much freer in choosing their own paths, than what has traditionally. I can't judge that for Oman, but I think it will be the same in Oman, as we have seen it here in Europe, that it was clearer 1 or 2 generations ago that you would enter into the family business than it is today.
One last question. Germany, as you rightly stated, is a leader in the automotive sector. Oman has expressed interest in setting up this industry here locally. But do you think the lack of legacy, proprietary tech, and experienced human resources will hinder the country's capability to move towards this ambition?
Now, in the automotive industry that Germany is a part, moving also in industries to e-mobility. So the question is, in what part are we really thinking of? If we're talking about the OMEs or the battery system. Then the second thing is that one would have to bear in mind, if you look at how much robotics has developed, so what is, if you think about economic growth, how much do you want it to be linked with, do you link it with employment and other questions? So that is the kind of question, what kind of why would you want economic growth? Is it the employment side or the growth side important? So it would be interesting that you would do it, but it would not be Germany that I would only look to, but I would look at the competitive situation to China, to be frank. Because we're in a worldwide competition. So it's not for me to judge, but I would have a very strong look at whether you could, from a money perspective, compete with China.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Ann. The time you've taken to respond to these questions are highly appreciated. Would it be okay if I ask just one additional question?
Yeah, of course.
How can we attract successful startups in Oman?
I think the fact that first people come to Oman, as I mentioned, my first trip to Oman, and are deeply impressed and come to know the country is very important because we're all humans, so it's important to come to like it. The second thing is as I said, links that you have, exchange programs with universities, where in certain fields people come down to work together. And then what I would actually do, what I've seen is tour in certain fields, that for example, in oil and gas or in others, try to build links, maybe, related to certain age cohorts, but traveling and coming together. What we see, in a very organized fashion. That you could, for example, if we talked about the second field, look about who's doing that in Germany, or France or whatsoever, and set up meetings. So that I strongly believe in the power of personal meetings.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Ann, for taking some time to respond to the questions that have been submitted by the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed the second edition of Muscat Stock Exchange Chairman's Dialogue. Thank you to our online audience for your participation. The insightful questions you've submitted have undoubtedly enriched this discussion. That brings us to the end of today's Chairman's Dialogue. I'd like to once again thank our esteemed speaker, Professor Dr. Ann-Kristin, for sharing her expertise, and of course to Mr. Al Ardhi for his participation. We promise to be back with many more enlightening sessions in the near future. So please keep an eye out for announcements that we will be making in regards to the third edition of the Chairman's Dialogue. I hope you have all gained valuable insights from today's session. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann-Kristin.
Thank you very much.
Take care.